Thank you for attending today's Sustainable Living Festival webinar session. Today's session is what you need to know about solar. I'm Kelly Porter, LES Communications Manager, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for spending time with us today. Just a couple things to keep in mind. We are recording this session, and it is in listen-only mode, but you can submit a question through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And we'll go ahead and address those questions at the end of John Hay's presentation. At this time, I'd like to introduce John Hay. He's the Extension Educator focused on renewable energy and biofuels for Nebraska Extension. John has been teaching youth and adult audiences for 15 years, and recent efforts include detailed economic analysis of distributed photovoltaic systems. John has hosted 3 hands-on solar design and installation workshops, taught solar economics in more than 12 states, and installed his own 4.4 kilowatt solar array at his home in 2017. Welcome, John Hay.
Great, thanks. I'm glad to be here. I'm gonna get my presentation pulled up here, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Wonderful.
All right, are you seeing my presentation?
We are.
Very good. All right, well, hello everyone, and I'm really excited to be here and presenting to you, and I really enjoy working with LES and appreciate all that they do to bring energy information to the public, because obviously you're the users and the purchasers of that energy, but they being a public utility, feel a responsibility to help you understand how they provide that to you. So I think that's really, really important of them to do, and so really appreciate that. We're going to cover today a number of things about solar, but obviously with the length of time, we're not going to cover every single detail, but this is where your questions can come in. If we want to cover something in more detail, let us know, and your questions are more important in some ways than the overall presentation. But what I'm going to cover today is the motivations of owning solar photovoltaics, how they work, the installation process, net metering, and then briefly about community solar. And then I'm going to try to apply that to community solar here in Lincoln in LES, but it applies also to other types of community solar as well. Now, motivations to the system are really important, because some people will say, well, the payback isn't short enough. It's not a good deal, or some other thing. But the reality is that depending on your motivations, solar might be right for you or it might not be. So that's where you want to analyze and think about those motivations. So I'm just going to go through a couple of those that I hear from the public. One is they want renewables. There are people that have a conservation ethic and really want to be part of the green energy system, and that can be a motivation. They want to feel more independent. That could be true independence where they have a battery backup, or it could be just an independence of feeling I created some of my own electricity. They might need electricity. There are remote cabins and remote installations where we're going to build an off-grid system, and they need electricity for that. And maybe it's too expensive to get the grid extended. So that might be some remote cabin or a watering station or something like that. Marketing. If you're a business and want to be seen as green, solar can be one of those things where you can put solar up where it can be seen by the customers, and then you are known as a green business in that way. So marketing can be important. Investment. In terms of, I want to install solar to get a payback, and if that is your motivation, then that's what you need to take into account. You need to do a good job with that investment analysis. The reality is most people have more than one motivation. They want green and they want an investment. And they need to kind of justify those two things together to decide if this is right for them. And those motivations are really important. And it helps determine what your system should look like, how big your system is, how much you're willing to spend, all these things. So really think about your motivations. I'm going to go over a little bit, just some terminology to help you have good discussions about solar with installers, with each other, with the utility, so you have some terminology. The entire system is called the solar photovoltaic array. So when you think about a solar array, that's the whole system all together. Each individual solar panel is called a module by the industry. It's called a solar panel by everyone else, and I'm going to use both interchangeably, and I think that that's acceptable. So the solar photovoltaic panel or module. So when you go shopping for them, if you were actually in the market, you call it a module. When you type in your search, you're going to find that. Each solar module is made up of solar photovoltaic cells, which are about 6 inches by 6 inches, and they either have 60 of them or 72 of them are the two most common sizes. So there is some general standardization in the industry. If I buy a 60-cell solar panel, it has about the same dimensions of every other 60-cell solar panel, and the same with 72. So very similar dimensions. This is also important because as we look at the tariffs that were put in place by the federal government recently, about a year and a half ago, it said that there's a import tariff on imported solar modules and cells, and then it actually excluded quite a few cells from that tariff to allow import of some cells without tariff in order to allow U.S. manufacturers that buy imported cells and put the modules together in the United States to purchase those. So kind of helps us understand the tariffs and other things that are happening at the federal level. Most solar panels have a base of chemistry of silicon, and silicon has some really special characteristics that allow electrons to flow around the crystal freely inside the crystal, and that is a good electrical property. And then they also have pretty good sunlight absorbing properties that make for good healthy solar panels. So let's talk about how that works. An electric field is needed to be able to help that electron go the correct direction so that can be captured on a wire and transported to have our electric current. And so to create an electric field without other electricity, they use other molecules or other atoms, phosphorus and boron in this case, which give us an electric field. And I'll show you how that's done. So some phosphorus is put into some of the silicon, some boron is put into another part of the silicon, and an electric field is created where phosphorus gives us a net negative charge, boron gives a net positive charge, and then a electric field is created inside that solar cell, a natural electric field with a positive side and a negative side, and they call that the PN junction, positive negative junction. So this is if we were to cut that cell in half and look at it kind of from the side. Let's just look a little bit about the movement of the electrons and the electricity. So I have now added to this a little metal wire. If you look at a solar panel, there will be little metal wires on the surface. You can imagine that this little line is that metal wire. Let's throw in some sunlight. That electron gets excited and moves through the wire, used by the load, turning the light on, and then that electron with less energy recombines to the bottom side. So the electron was never created or destroyed. It simply was given energy, the energy was taken away, and it recombined. So we can watch that again. The electron is excited, flows towards the positive side, gets caught in the wire, goes around the loop, and then recombines on the back side. There's something else happening that I think tells us a little bit about electricity and is a little kind of fun and interesting, and not necessarily something we are all that clear about if we don't live in the electricity world. And that is that something else is happening. And that is these little red dots are flowing. Let's watch that one more time. Throw in that sunlight. Those red circles are flowing in the opposite direction. And those are actually the holes, H-O-L-E, hole, the absence of an electron that's left behind. And you can almost imagine the absence of electron being positively charged because an electron is missing now. And those flow in the opposite direction. And the interesting thing about that is then when we label this solar cell, we're actually going to label the flow of the holes as the positive charge, the positive side, and the flow of the electrons as the negative side. And so when we think about electricity flowing, it's the flow of the holes, not the flow of the electrons. And so that's kind of an odd thing. And there's an interesting reason why we have that. And go back to history just for a second. And that is that Ben Franklin made an observation about electricity. He did not invent it, but he made some observations about electricity. He made an observation and said, it appears that the electricity is flowing in this direction, and I'm going to label that the positive side, and his label has stuck. We could have labeled it just the opposite, and it would have been fine. And the physicist might have been more happy because that's more of what really is happening. But the reality is he labeled it that way, we've stuck with it, and it works out just fine. So we're living with kind of a history of labeling things essentially incorrectly, but that's okay. It all works out as long as we all work from the same convention. Let's talk about the steps in the solar process. So now we kind of have these solar panels that are able to make electricity from sunlight. And we want to put them on a home or a business to help us offset some of the electricity that we use. This is kind of a process that I put together through helping a lot of people through this process, including myself. But number one is to study electric bills and efficiency. You should be paying attention to how much electricity you use and if there are the ability to reduce that in efficiency, insulation, LED lights, because you're going to have a better bang for your buck through efficiency than you are from solar. So that's a great place to start, is to understanding that. Spend some time with your electric bill. You want to do your solar homework, and your solar homework is really about the goals and motivations that we talked about a minute ago. And if you still are in the market and you think, okay, I've done some efficiency things, I feel like I've gotten all the big ones, I've done my homework and I really have a high motivation for solar, now you might want to get some quotes and do some more analysis and talk to installers and things like that. So in the red in this slide are the things that you as a potential owner are going to do. The green is something that the utility does, or where the utility is involved, and the blue is where the installer and the electrician and those kind of people are involved. And so in this number 4, that's actually green for the utility, but the owner and the installer are involved as well. So that's a discussion, and you're bringing that utility in early in the process to have that discussion. Is that because they have to give you permission to put it in? Well, yes and no. You are allowed to by federal and state law if it meets the correct safety requirements. But having them involved early helps you avoid issues and helps you avoid headaches and things like that. So that's why that's in there early. Not that they can say no later. They can say no. It's that they can help avoid headaches. And then the installer is going to do some design, installation, purchasing of all those things. And then back to utility on number 17, you're going to have a utility agreement that allows you to connect that to the grid and the rules in that. You're going to have a meter that is able to get set up to meter the electricity. And then finally, you're commissioning it, turning it on. So that process is not super fast, but it can go pretty fast if you work with your installer, you work with your utility, and everything's kind of smooth. It'll go pretty well. There's lots of parts of a solar array. We've talked about the solar panels or the modules already, but there's also the racking that has to hold the panels on, all kinds of wiring, maybe some trenching. The inverter is what turns the solar electricity into grid quality electricity. And so that's a really important piece of equipment. The disconnect, which allows that system to be shut off in case it's needed to be. Combiner box and meter. So there's all kinds of different parts. There's also a lot of little detail parts that I don't have on this slide, but it's not just solar panels and inverter. It's all the pieces combined. Let's think about that electricity flow now. This is a rudimentary drawing of a solar array at a home or a business. And we're going to think about the electricity for a moment. If we we get to work and we turn things on, the electricity may flow from the grid to our business. and that's the way things normally work, and goes through the meter, and they're able to keep track of that. If I have a solar and the sun comes up that same day, I'm going to get some electricity from the solar array to the load. I could be getting it from the grid and the solar array at the same time. But when it comes from the solar array and gets used directly by the load, it's pretty clear that the value of that electricity is offsetting retail electricity. It's electricity that I'm not using from the grid. So whatever the electricity from the grid was valued at, that's the value of that electricity. Then maybe we go to lunch, we turn things off, the sun is still out, then that electricity flows from the solar onto the grid. When the solar flows from the solar onto the grid, it again goes through the meter, and they're keeping track of that. But now we have what is called excess generation. And the value of that excess generation is the detail that we need to study on to make sure we understand what is that value and how much excess generation do we generate. So this is where this term net metering comes in. And we're going to talk about both net metering and not net metering. So first of all, let's think about electricity. Now I have a really rough drawing here, and I'm going to say that every kilowatt hour is worth 10 cents. I know that's not true. I know that a lot of utilities in the state, electricity is really worth somewhere between maybe 6 and 12 cents per kilowatt hour across the state. But 10 cents is a nice round number, so it works for our explanation here. Let's think about the cost of electricity. Only a portion of that electricity is the actual energy, what it took to generate that energy. And I'm going to say that that's worth 3 cents. Again, I'm just using some rudimentary numbers here to give us an example of what we're paying for. Another portion of that kilowatt hour is the transmission, which is the maintenance of the long distance transmission lines across the United States or our region. And we have to pay for that to keep those in good order. And so a portion of that is in transmission. And then a third portion of that is in distribution, which we can imagine is our local power lines in our city or town or our local area. Now, there are other costs involved in your electric bill, and you're going to see these. You're going to have a base fee or a customer charge. There'll be some taxes, fees, maybe adjustments, depending on what your bill looks like. Now, the reality is when you're paying for all of these things in your kilowatt hour, that's where if I generate that from solar, that solar is generating energy. And if I'm giving that energy to the grid, and I'm not talking about just LES, I'm talking about all utilities now, that grid says, well, that energy is great, thank you for that, but really I can buy that for 3 cents somewhere else. I only want to pay you then 3 cents for that energy. And so that's where there is discussions about what is the value of that electricity that goes onto the grid, that excess generation. Now, things are always changing, and I want to at least bring one up that I think is an important one that's changing slowly, and that is that this base fee here is paying for some overhead of the utility and the billing system and other things. But one thing that is beginning to happen is we're beginning to take some of these costs and move them over to the base fee, which then allows the system to become more stable over time. So we're paying for some maintenance of transmission and distribution in our base fee. And then we're able to we raise that base fee, but we might actually lower or not raise as fast our per kilowatt hour charge, right? So it would offset if they were to raise that. So that's happening across the United States in different places. There's different ways of moving these around. And the level of transparency in your bill is varied across different utilities. So if you see these I can tell you that in my bill, I couldn't even tell you what my base fee is in my bill. I'm not on LES, by the way. And I'm just outside of Lincoln, so I am on a different utility. And I have to call them and ask my base fee because it's not even on my bill. So not a lot of transparency there. But this helps us understand how we're billed for electricity. Let's think about then, our solar array connected to a business or a home. And in this case, we're looking at the green being how much electricity is used. So the green is how much total electricity is used, and the yellow is how much solar is generated on one day. This is one day. And so it's pretty clear that because the solar never generated at any time of day more than what was used, all of that solar was used by the load and is all thus worth the retail rate. It offset buying. So I avoided buying from the utility that amount of electricity. All right. Let's imagine another day where maybe my load isn't as high and my solar did much better. And so in this case, I have a scenario going where, again, the green is the load and the yellow is the solar. And I have a couple things happening. We can imagine that under the blue line is the load, under the yellow is the solar. And so the part that's now in green is the electricity that went from the solar directly to the load, and it has a value of retail rate. The blue areas are directly from the utility, and its cost is retail rate. And then I have this third section, this yellow, that went out onto the grid. And that's value is determined by net metering. So in the case of I don't have net metering, I'm just simply going to get paid a dollars per kilowatt hour for that value. And that dollars, remember that energy charge in transmission distribution, that might just be the energy charge that I get paid for. So I might get paid some lesser amount for that electricity in the case of not net metering. In the case of net metering, it's a policy put in place by the state or the utility. In this case, we have a state law in Nebraska that says that we can take this electricity and get credit for it to offset some of that blue during a certain billing period. And so that's the power of net metering as a policy, is it allows, instead of getting, we'll use our examples, instead of getting 3 cents, we're actually making that worth 10 cents. So that's a big value to the solar customer, in that case, the solar owner, to get some value out of the electricity. So that's the power of net metering. Net metering is one of the reasons I explain it in multiple ways is it is one of those things that's not always clear to everyone on the first presentation. So here's another slide that helps me understand net metering when I think about my system. Is now I have 3 movements of electricity, and I presented these earlier, and that we have a value for A, a value for B, and then we can call this one C down here. But what we know is that A is retail rate, because that's what we're buying it from the utility. We know that C is retail rate because it's offsetting A. And then that B is excess generation. In the case of net metering, this is where that word net really helps. All I'm simply doing is taking A minus B. And so as long as B is smaller than A, then B is worth retail rate for all of B. There are situations where I overgenerate, where B is larger than A. In that case, only the difference do I get that reduced value, for only the difference. And so that's the net. A minus B is the net. Let's imagine a situation where Nebraska, for some reason, got rid of net metering, or you live in a place in Nebraska where the utility has exceeded how much net metering they're required to net meter, and thus the next system is not net metered. So we're going to go to a not net metered system and look at it on the next slide. So here's our clean slide for a not net metered system. And again, A is worth retail, C is worth retail, because C is offsetting A, but now I'm going to get paid for B separately. So I have, let's say, a value, let's make it 3 cents for B, and I have 10 cents for A, and all of B then is worth 3 cents. Again, does that mean I can't hook a system to the grid? No, I can under federal rules, but what that value of that electricity is then reduced. Thus, the economics of that system are probably not as good as one that could be net metered. So that's where net metering is a powerful incentive, and I'm going to call it an incentive, even though it's just a rule about metering. It's a powerful incentive that helps the economics of solar for distributed customers. I'm going to talk just briefly about design, because design, we can get in all kinds of details, but people are really interested in you know, how this should be designed. So let's first of all think about the tilt angle. What is the tilt angle that is optimum here in Nebraska? And I modeled this system in Grand Island, and when I think about the optimum, I'm thinking about where do I produce the most electricity? And the tilt angle of about 40 degrees gave us the peak kilowatt hours per year, annual kilowatt hours in Grand Island. If I was to go a little bit north, maybe up to the South Dakota border, that might be about 42 degrees tilt. If I go to the Kansas state line, it might be 38 or something like that. But it's pretty much in that range of 40. But you can also see that the tilt angle is not real sensitive, that even the ones that are 10 degrees different are only down by about a couple percent. So tilt is important, but it's not real sensitive. So if you don't have an optimum tilt and you have a just suboptimum by 10 or 15 degrees, you're still generating 96 or 98% of what you would if you had an optimum tilt. So tilt is important, but not super. You should not spend a lot of money to get that optimum tilt. That's what I'm trying to say. Now you have these two on the right side. These are kind of interesting scenarios where I have tracking. One axis tracking would face east in the morning, and it would turn and face west in the evening. And every day it would tilt. And then two axis tracking, I do the east-west tilt, but I also tilt to the south in the winter and a little flatter in the summer. It's two axis tracking. Those systems are used in, especially one axis tracking are used in commercial systems. Two axis tracking, it happens on some small systems, but the reality is, although you do get a lot better performance, you have a lot of expense and a lot of moving parts and more opportunity for breakdown. And so I typically don't like those types of systems. If I want to generate that much, I'll simply make my fixed system slightly larger and to generate that same amount of electricity. So that's the way I would deal with that. That fixed system is fairly robust and has no moving parts, and that's very powerful. Now let's think about what direction we should face. Should we face it north, south, east, or west? Well, if we think about the sun, and we're in the northern hemisphere, the sun generally is to the south of us. In the wintertime, it's low on the horizon. In the summertime, it's somewhat directly overhead. But the reality is we want to face that south. And this is where I receive optimum or the peak production of my system when it faces south. If I face that east or west, I lose 23% of my production by facing that east or west at that same tilt angle. And God forbid I face it north, then it doesn't do as well because it only really gets sun in the middle of the summer. It doesn't get sun the rest of the time. So flat would be better than facing it north. So when you think about facing it east or west, it's a matter of trying to decide if that loss of production is going to harm you economically enough that it hurts your ability or your desire to put the system in. So it's not that you shouldn't put it in east or west, but it's a matter of you're going to lose some production annually. So we'll talk about some other things about east and west a little later as well. This is a fun graph, and I'm going to try to make it less complicated, but what I have across the top is the tilt angle. So 180 is due south, and then we have east, and then we have west, and so you can start to see that same thing, and then we have tilt angles. And so what we're seeing then is that 100 in this case is very close to that maximum production for this particular setup. This is one modeled in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so if you put that anywhere from 180 to 190 degree azimuth direction, and you have it somewhere between 30 and about 44 degrees tilt, then I'm going to have that really within about a rounding error of 100%. So does that mean that every system should be put in like that? Well, I'm not sure that's true, but I really do believe that if you have a chance to put in a system, you really probably ought to try to get it within this rectangle where you're getting most of that production and you're not harming yourself quite a bit. Now, there are reasons maybe it's okay to be outside of this, but if you can do it, try to get within this circle. And so that means that the tilt angle, really, you have a range of which direction you should face it. Try to face it south. But if it's not exactly south, you're not hurt terribly. And really from about 20 degrees to about 50 degrees would work pretty well, because then you're getting over 90% of the potential annual production of optimal. So that's kind of the way I think about design a little bit and where these should be put. Generally face them south, generally face them, put them at an angle 20 to 40 degrees would be pretty darn good in Nebraska. Let's think about the system from an economic standpoint a little bit. And this gross system cost is really important because the gross system cost is what I'm going to write the check for. And then I'm going to get these incentives and other things that are going to reduce that. But I need to not subtract those out at first because I need to know what I'm going to write that check for. I don't want somebody to say, well, that thing only cost $10,000 when actually I have to write the check for $18,000. Okay, so my gross system cost is what I write the check for. Then there are federal incentives. Currently, that's a 20% investment tax credit, 26% investment tax credit. So I can get in my tax return 26% of the value of that directly back in next year's taxes. If you wait till next year, it's going to be 22%. I've got a slide that talks about that in a minute, but that's the investment tax credit from the federal level. If I have a business, I can also depreciate that as part of my business, and I can get some value, some tax reduction from that. There might be other incentives, grants, and loans. That could be from the federal government in the case of USDA, Rural Energy for America. That could be your own utilities program. And LES has a program. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. There could be renewable energy credits. Those in Nebraska really have no value at the moment, but in other states there is value in renewable energy credits. And finally, now I have my net cost or the balance of that investment. So I have what I'm going to now do the calculations for my investment analysis based on. So I'm going to reduce those incentives. That's the cost of my system, the net cost, and I have to pay that back by making electricity. So ongoing energy savings. What is the cost of a system? That's what everyone wants to know. What's it going to cost? Well, it depends on the size, but we have some numbers here that we can then scale by size. And there's two things about this that are important. Number one is look at the decrease in price of systems over time. They have decreased dramatically, which has increased people's interest in these systems, and it should, because it really helps with economics. This is 2018. I know it's 2020, but these numbers are pretty accurate from 2018. They haven't changed a lot since 2018. I have two numbers on here, residential and commercial, and some of that's about size. Because when I think about commercial, I'm usually building bigger systems. Bigger systems tend to have some economies of scale and can reduce the cost. So if we said that a residential system was $2.70 per watt installed. So if this was a 10 kW system, my gross cost would be $27,000. So 10 kW is 10,000. 10,000 times 2.7 is $27,000. So, and I think $2.70 per watt total installed cost, that's everything included, is in the range of what we're seeing in Nebraska today. We're seeing a few a little higher, we're seeing a few a little lower. It's in that range pretty well. That $1.83, as systems get larger, I have seen costs of $1.83 in the larger scale systems. The 100 megawatt, or not megawatt, 100 kW systems, that type of thing. In Nebraska, I've seen that $1.83. And I've definitely seen that in a number of quotes farther east in Illinois, Ohio, Indiana. We've seen a number of systems that were going in at that price. So when you get a quote it's not that you're looking for that quote to be $2.70. You're looking for that quote. How close is it to that, and why is it different? If you're requiring the highest efficiency modules, for example, that price is probably going to be a little higher than that. If your system is a roof mount, they tend to be a little bit less than a ground mount because there's less equipment, right? So there's these balancing factors, but it's a good range. And these numbers came out of the Renewable Energy Lab, the Federal Renewable Energy Lab. But they're pretty accurate. Let's break down those costs just a little bit. The modules, remember, the modules are what actually decreased in price over that time period that drove that down. But the modules are only 20% of the cost of the system. The inverter's 4, the balance of the system electrical is 14, the soft costs is 9, and then the others, so that would be the soft costs like permits. Actually, this 9% should be like permits and fees and things like that is 9, and 50% is going to be the labor, the tax, the overhead, the permitted, the profit. I think this permitting got on the wrong line as well. But so 50% is, you know, basically the installation of that system. And so it's just important to recognize now, can you install your own? Yes, but you do want to do it to electric code, and that sometimes is challenging. And that's where a professional installer is going to really help to make sure that that's done appropriately. If you are considering your own, do a lot of homework, talk to professionals, making sure you're doing that right, because these have to be inspected, they need to be done right. But this is kind of the breakdown. The one thing I like about showing this chart is people ask me things about hail. And yes, they're susceptible to hail, but they're pretty tough. So I'd say they're about as tough as my asphalt shingle roof. And if my roof is destroyed, my solar panels might be as well. But I have 2 thoughts about that being destroyed by hail. Number one is that the system is insured by my homeowner insurance. And the second is that if I had to replace the panels, that's only 20% of the cost of the system. My inverters are likely not harmed. The racking is not harmed, and a lot of things. So I don't have to replace the entire cost again, right? The federal incentives are declining. Currently, the plan is that they are declining over time. They're at 26% in 2020, 22% next year, 10% in 2022. For businesses, they're set to stay at 10%. For residences, they're set to go to 0 after 2022. There is talk at the federal level of renewing this and trying to get this extended. We'll see what happens. But right now, we're planning for that federal tax credit to go away. Let's just finish up with some stuff on LES. LES, this is my take on it. I did not consult with them to put these slides together, because I figured, you know, this is my take as an employee of the university and trying to give information that Lincoln Electric Systems recognizes that there's value in distributed solar, and they're passing some of that value on to the customers as a capacity payment. And so currently, that payment is $375, it's a one-time payment, per kW for south-facing systems, and $475 if you face it west. Again, that's about their peak demand time. That's why facing west is giving a little more value. So if I had a 10 kW system, I'm getting a check from LES for $3,750. And I'm getting that right away in year 1. That, again, is one of those incentives that is offsetting the cost of that system, right? So that is Lincoln, being a public utility, passing some of their value on to the customers. Let's talk about a financial analysis just a little bit. I'm not going to go into great detail about this because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. But these are some of the assumptions that have to be made on the left-hand side to get to the financial metrics on the right-hand side. And I'm just going to point out a couple of them that are really important. Degradation. That solar panel is going to generate slightly less over time. We need to take that into account. Shading. I've seen installers give quotes to customers and not take shading into account, and they put the darn solar panel right next to a tree. They're not going to produce as much as they would if that was not under a tree. So we need to take that into account. And that is a problem with certain installers. I'm talking this very broadly across the nation, not just in Nebraska. Net excess generation, again, we talked about what is the value of that and accurately modeling that value. And that's some of the net metering stuff we talked about. Inflation. Does electricity cost the same today as it will in 10 years? No, likely it'll cost more in 10 years because of inflation. So we need to get the proper inflation rate put in. And I've seen some installers do some rough things. The things I have in red here are ways that we can that potentially a salesman could manipulate a quote to try to make it look better than it really should be. They could say, well, there's going to be an inflation rate of 6%. Didn't you know that the electricity is going up really fast? Well, the reality is if we look back 10 and even up to 30 years, that inflation rate of electricity has only been in the 2 to 3% range. So putting in a higher inflation rate than that is probably a little extreme and overemphasizing or overestimating the value of electricity, making it look too good. Operation and maintenance. Yes, solar has low maintenance, but that does not mean it has no maintenance. I replaced an inverter yesterday at the University of Nebraska for a solar system we had under warranty, but that although the inverter was under warranty, we still had to pay for an electrician for an hour. We had to pay for an installer for a couple hours. And so there was some operation and maintenance cost for that system that needed to be paid. So those need to be, let's just talk about financial metrics. Everybody wants to know what the payback is. Payback is a good metric. If you want this to be an investment though, the net present value is the best financial metric to look at or if this system is a good investment for you. So payback is good, net present value is the best. If you want more information, I'll put this link in the website, but I do have a fairly long written publication that details how to do this economic analysis if you're interested in doing it. You could also contact me, but I'll have this and I'll put it in the link. Okay, so this is the last thing I have, and I'm done. And I'm going to run just a minute over before I plan, but that's not too bad. I'm going to call this section Your Solar. So your solar, on the left-hand side, you're going to own the system. You're going to install it at your home or business, and you're going to own it. There are positives to owning a system. One, you get the tax credit. Number two, it's attached to your house or business, so you get to have that green feeling. It's mine and it's here. Your neighbors get to see it. You get to brag about it to your neighbors. All good things. You get depreciation, you get the tax credit, you get the marketing if that's important to you. There are some cons to owning your own system. You're responsible for operation and maintenance. You have to write that check for the initial cost, which that's probably true about all systems. But if you move, you may not be able to regain all the value of that investment. So if you build that system and move in 5 years, your sale price of your house or business may not reflect what you spent on that solar. So that can be a challenge. You have to think about your long term. So owning it has pros and cons. Community solar projects are common across Nebraska. There's one here in Lincoln, but there's also some in other states. There are pros and cons to community solar systems. One positive is that you can participate without having a place to install it. Maybe you have an apartment. Maybe you've got a house that's just covered in trees. Good, that's great shade for you, but doesn't lend itself to solar well. You can still participate in a solar project. If you move, you can sell it back in many cases. Not for the same price you bought it for, but for less. But you can still sell it back and not have that risk of getting a lot less value for it. You don't have any O&M. The community solar project is responsible for O&M. That's built into the price you paid. You don't have to worry about it. There's little or no risk in that way. You kind of everything's spelled out to begin with, and you don't have that. There's no kind of unknowns with respect to that. Hailstorms and other things, it's under their insurance. They'll deal with it. You don't have to worry. Some of the negatives about community solar projects is you don't get the tax credit. You don't get the depreciation. And if you want the bragging power for having that on your house, you don't have it. So some of those aren't real big negatives, but at the same time, those are some of the cons for that community solar project. So different people are going to invest in owning their own or buying from a community project, depending on how things work for them. LES has a community solar project, and they call their system to buy into it virtual net metering. Remember, I just consulted their website and talked with them, make sure I got this slide accurate, but I think they're going to present a little bit later on some of the details of this. But you can purchase half or whole panels from this system. You get credit for the production of those panels each month, offsetting your kilowatt hours of use. So it's kind of like that net metering where you didn't actually, the solar was generated somewhere else, your kilowatt hours were used at your home, but they offset equally to that amount. And so it's a virtual net metering setup, but that's how that's set up. And again, that's that community solar where this can work out well, especially if you can't buy into solar other ways, or maybe you don't want to buy it, have one on your house. So it's a way to get into the solar market without having one on your home. And also it's a little bit scalable. On your home, you're typically maybe not going to want to put in 1 or 2 panels. You might put in 10 or 15. Well, this one you could purchase just 2 or 3 panels. So different ways to get into this market. I'm going to just show some pictures of my system real quick. I installed it in 2017. My crew was not particularly hardworking. They took a lot of breaks. I built this as an addition to my garage, and you can kind of see as I put that together. Here the solar racking is going in. The solar panels are in. The inverter is there. It's not quite wired up yet in that picture, but that provides enough electricity for about 60% of my house on an annual basis. That is about 24 foot by about 13 foot in total size, and has worked very well since 2017. I really haven't touched it since 2017, and that's a good thing, right? Low maintenance. A couple more pictures of my system as it goes in. And the last one is it's important to have all the proper markings. This is part of the electric code, and having that all put together so when utility comes, they can see exactly what's going on. Let's go to questions. What do we have for questions? I have lots of pictures, but we'll go to questions for now.
To submit questions, you can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I did have one pre-submitted question, John, that talked about just as far as like placing it on your home, what kind of codes are customers going to be wanting to know, and how has that changed over the last couple of years?
The building codes part really hasn't changed very much, and depending on how unique the system is, the engineering may or may not need to be done. In the case of a typical roof mount, the manufacturers have some engineering already done that say that this rail has to be attached to the roof in so many places to withstand the wind load and some of that. So some of that's pretty standard. But what has changed in the last number of years is the electric code and what the electric code requires with respect to what they call rapid shutdown. Rapid shutdown is so let's go forward a bit. Rapid shutdown this is an example here, is that when the grid is down and the solar is still running, for my system, this wire is still energized, even when the grid is down. It's not sending any electricity to the grid, but that piece of wire is energized. And under the new code, I remember mine was installed in the old code, so mine meets code. But if under the new code, if it was installed today, this would have had to be stopped, that energizing right there. So under the new code, I would have probably put in microinverters that would shut that off at the solar panel level, rather than having this hot wire potentially available. So that's called the rapid shutdown rule, and it's a really important rule that your electrical installer should know. And I like to ask that question to an installer, do I need rapid shutdown? Because they need to be able to tell you what that rule is and if they need it, because that means they're up on the electric code, because that particular code has changed 2 times in the last 2 electric code changes. So really important one to consider.
Okay. Not seeing any other questions.
Okay.
What advice would you give to somebody who is weighing the options of rooftop solar versus like a community solar, if they're looking for more of instead of the payback, just more of a community support?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I would really think about to begin with is just to start with, well, there's a lot of things that might come into play, but let's just start with one, which is how long are you going to be in your home? If this is your grandparents' home and you think that this is going to be around forever, that's going to be a little different consideration than if I moved into this home 5 years ago and I might move into a different one in 5 or 10 years, because that moving really influences whether I want to put that on the house. Because if I move within the city of Lincoln and I purchased into the solar program under community solar, I can move and it still applies to my new residence, right? It doesn't matter. I could also sell it back if I move out of town. So I have more flexibility with respect to that. The other thing that I think is interesting about community solar at times is that if one of the things about buying into community solar or helping with it is that a lot of times we can get a much bigger system than we can otherwise. And remember, with bigger systems, there's some economies of scale. So that can help as well. And it would take, for example, the system out west of Lincoln is approximately 5 megawatts or 5,000 kilowatts. It would take a lot of individual solar systems to ever make 5,000 kilowatts of electricity, of power. So I can actually, by investing it, we can get a lot bigger and get a lot more solar. Now, I'm going to tell you one interesting little negative that I've heard that I think is really interesting, and which is to say that if that community solar project is already built, they built the system, and I'm really interested in climate change, for example. Does buying into that program put more green electricity on the grid? No, because that system is already built. So some people that are really, really keen on climate change, they want to know that their investment resulted in more green electricity on the grid. And so in that case, they would want to maybe invest in a community solar if they could get in ahead to make it bigger, or they would want to put in their own, which then guaranteed more green electricity being used on the system. So kind of interesting mix of ideas there. So
yeah,
good question.
I have another question submitted. Is there a possibility to combine solar assistance generation to electric vehicle charging stations?
Yes. Depending on exactly the details of what you're thinking about as that question, but some of these companies, this inverter that is mine is made by a company called SMA. I'm not advertising for SMA, I'm just saying that's what it is. But a couple of those companies, Fronius is another one, Solar Edge is another one, offer solar charging stations as part of the inverter setup. So when you build a solar and put in the inverter, there's a car charging station built into the inverter. And so then you could program that to charge your car from solar. You could program it to charge from the grid through the panel, or some mix of that. And so then if you wanted to know that your car charging was only from solar, there are program settings within that solar charging unit. So it is being built into a number of the inverter systems for car charging. If, for example, you built them at separate times and they weren't connected, that doesn't mean that they're still not connected, because if my solar is generating, electricity is going into my home, and my car is being charged, that car is still charging from solar. I'm just not charging it only from solar. I might be charging from the solar and the grid, right, at the same time, depending on how much I was drawing. So it doesn't guarantee that it comes from solar, but that's where that solar charging station can, in the case that you put them in at the same time. Good question.
Thank you, John. I have another pre-submitted question, and this one was specific to Tesla, but I think it would apply to any solar tiles as a kind of a low profile option on rooftop solar. How do they compare to a system such as you put on your home?
Well, from a how they function standpoint, they're going to compare pretty well. But if you were to try to purchase a solar roof system from Tesla in Nebraska today, you might be waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. It's not going to happen. They have that market is very limited. They're only installing in certain locations. And this is kind of this love-hate relationship I have with Tesla. I really like what they're doing. I really like their ideas. But what I don't like is that they put products forward like they're available to the public when they're only partially or even not available to the public, right? And so this is their solar roof. What happened is one of their solar roof things, they actually took people's money for a bunch of years saying, sign up for solar roofs. And then actually about 6 months ago, they went back. They went back and said, oh, but we're only going to install them in these areas. And they gave that money back to all those people that in areas that they weren't going to install, right? So those people that were, there was a group of people anyway that tried to buy them, but were not able to get them. So the idea of a solar tile or low profile is very cool. I hope it eventually becomes more available, but it's really not that available right now. So what I would say is that again, you're going to have to think about, are you going to want to wait for something that's more ideal, or are you going to take advantage of what's available now? That's up to you. So I would say I like the idea. What I don't like is the availability of those systems right now. They're just not available.
Okay, thank you. Well, not seeing any additional questions coming into the queue. Do you have any parting words on where we can get any additional information on solar?
Oh yeah, absolutely. One is my website, which is bioenergy.unl.edu. I have a number of publications on there. That's one place that we have locally. Also, I'm gonna call out a advocacy group for solar, even though I tend to say I want to be educational and not an advocate. But Nebraskans for Solar, that organization, has a lot of good information. And so if you want to know about which installers are in Nebraska, they have a good installer list. That's the list I would send you to, because I try to be even about installers and not try to show a lot of preference. But that's a place to look. So great.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to everybody who attended today's webinar. This webinar will be hosted on the Sustainable Living Festival event page as a YouTube link. Additional information can be found on LES's program at les.com/solar. And once you close down this webinar, you'll receive a pop-up of a survey. We just ask that you take a brief minute to fill out the survey so we can find better ways of serving you. So thanks for spending time with us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.